we haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the households, then we start making better investments.
I want every agency to lean forward.
Big Brother wants to be called Big Daddy now. Paul Joseph Watson writes, the U.S. Department of Education and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has published a draft document which outlines a plan that will treat families as equal partners in the raising of children, opening the door for government intrusion at all levels. The document states, the first step in systematically embedding effective family engagement practices in educational settings is to establish a culture where families are seen as assets and partners in children's development, learning, and wellness. The first two principles of effective family engagement practices state: 1. Create continuity for children and families. Implement a vision for family engagement that begins prenatally and continues across settings and throughout a child's developmental and educational experiences. 2. Value equal partnerships between families and professionals. Combine professional expertise with familial expertise to promote shared learning and responsibility for children's healthy development, learning, and wellness. Encourage two-way communication by valuing family input on all aspects of the child's life and development, including their culture, traditions, and home language. Well, that's nice of them, isn't it? Principle number 4 states, ensure constant monitoring and communication regarding children's social, emotional, and behavioral health. The paper describes how government employees will intervene to provide monitoring goals for children at home and the classroom, and that if parents are failing to meet the standards set, evidence-based parenting interventions will be made to ensure that children's social, emotional, and behavioral needs are met. Will there be home visits, you ask? Well, the document states home visits. To support ongoing relationship building with families, programs and schools should conduct periodic home visits so that teachers and families can get to know each other and communicate about children's goals, strengths, challenges, and progress. If home visits are not possible for all families, school or programs should require that teachers or providers and families communicate at the beginning of the year to ensure that the relationship is started in a positive way. The program bears the hallmarks of the controversial scheme in Scotland, set to take effect later this year, under which a shadow parent appointed by the government will monitor the upbringing of every child under the age of 18. The document also extends the understanding of the word family to include all the people who play a role in the child's life, a definition that could include not only teachers, but government monitors. In a related development, the federal government is pushing for a task force to oversee a program under which pediatricians and doctors would screen all students over 12 years old regularly for depression and issue prescriptions or treatment as necessary. Obviously, the program will increase the likelihood of teenagers being given dangerous antidepressant drugs such as Prozac and Lexapro. This bold New World Order draft declaration is nothing less than a declaration of war on American families by pedophilic government overseers, brought to you by the Obama administration, the very same administration that criminally wielded the power of the IRS and the NSA on their political adversaries. This is a big deal, a really big deal.
House Concurrent Resolution 353, concurrent resolution expressing the sense of the Congress that the United States should assume a strong leadership role in implementing the decisions made at the Earth Summit by developing a national strategy to implement Agenda 21 and other Earth Summit agreements through domestic policy and foreign policy, by cooperating with all countries to identify and initiate further agreements to protect the global environment, and by supporting and participating in a high-level United Nations Sustainable Development Development Commission.
Question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Concurrent Resolution 353 as amended? So many as are in favor will say aye. Those opposed, nay. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds of those present having voted in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The concurrent resolution is agreed to, and without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
It is the agenda for the 21st century you're living in today. For a brave new world where everything that you cherished and held true will no longer exist.
For without property rights, there are no human rights. There is no freedom. The foundation of our freedom is based really upon the ability of each and every one of us to own our property.
The question has been asked many times how the people who are perpetrating these things expect to do this and make it last when you have a nation of people who were raised and educated on individual rights and the Constitution and so forth. The answer to that is that you steal a generation of children and you indoctrinate them so that they accept these ideas and they become global citizens in the coming global village.
He's totally dedicated to the preservation of America. I'm glad to call him a friend. Michael, please come.
America has been swamped with a costly policy program that is increasingly supported by the courts across this country. The program is centered squarely upon the elimination of private property and free enterprise. It is swarming the country under the warm and fuzzy term, sustainable development.
I also would like to thank the elected officials that showed up, and we're glad you're here. This is probably one of the most important issues that you will face in your lifetime from here on out. This threatens everything that exists, and everything that you do will be controlled by this. And I'll leave it to her. She's a lot better with this than I am. Rosa Corey.
All right, I'm so glad to be here. Really appreciate it that all of you as Americans are concerned about this issue that is so very, very important to all of us. A joint Senate and House Resolution 587 was passed that is condemning the United Nations Agenda 21 Sustainable Development. It mirrors the Republican National Committee's resolution that does the same. I'm here to talk about something that is so important to us. This is a very serious threat to the continuing existence of our nation. And I don't get much more important than that. So as Americans, you'll find yourselves completely at odds with and deeply concerned by the agenda for the 21st century. And it's called that by the United Nations. That's why it's Agenda 21. It's the agenda for the 21st century. It's called that by the United Nations and by the world, all 179 nations that signed on to it. It is a blueprint. It is the action plan to inventory and control all land, all water, all minerals, all plants, all animals, all construction, all means of production, all information, and all human beings in the world. Doesn't get much more comprehensive than that, does it?
Sustainable development has become the popularized expression for Agenda 21. Agenda 21 is the 1992 United Nations Rio Declaration on the Environment and Development. Agenda 21 defines itself as the comprehensive plan of action to be taken globally, nationally, and locally by organizations of the United Nations systems, governments, and major groups in every area in which humans impact on the environment. Well, that doesn't leave anything. My goal in the next few minutes is to describe the origin, the general nature, and the implementation of Sustainable Development / Agenda 21, and illustrate how this global comprehensive plan is transforming the American systems of government, justice, and economics. Back in the 1990s, my exposure to Agenda 21 followed this pattern. I was a director on the local Santa Cruz County Resource Conservation District, which worked with the federal government's Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource Conservation System. And while doing that and having federal officials come to our meetings to proclaim the need for such things as wildland fires, that wildland fires were only not to be precluded, they were to be encouraged. And in this process, I found out about a local Agenda 21 program. Now, here in Sonoma, it's called 2020. The conditions of Santa Cruz since that time have begun to show the effects of 2020. Our forest lands, the Redwood Forest and the Santa Cruz Mountains, can't be timbered very easily. And now in over half the mountain, it is illegal to timber the redwoods. They're growing so close that the fire is only a matter of time before it chases the people out of the Santa Cruz Mountains. Only last month, the California Supreme Court, a 4-3 decision, said that it's, for the first time in the history of the state, it's not necessary. The state enforce timber policies. They granted all timber-making policies to the County Board of Supervisors in Santa Cruz. 2 weeks ago, our farmers lost a case that came as a result of a 1980s action which began the monitoring of all farmers' water in Santa Cruz County. In the 90s, the farmers began to be taxed on the drawing of their own water from their own wells. Today that is up to $200 an acre foot. They finally sued. They, of course, lost in the Santa Cruz County Superior Courts, went to the appellate courts in San Jose, and shockingly, in the state that has had the strongest water rights in the history of the world, they lost there too, as I realized from the stack of 70 pages of local newspaper articles describing the Creekside ordinances, which are sampled out of after Santa Cruz. In Santa Cruz, we've got a 2-lane freeway system. We need 4, but what we're getting is hundreds of millions of dollars of federal money to take a dilapidated rail line that Southern Pacific wants to put in the hands of somebody else so that a commuter line can be built along the railroad track. That'll be followed by 14-story buildings where people will live and stack them and pack them units, where developers, or so-called sustainable developers, will build these high rises with federal dollars. In fact, Santa Cruz has received a $300 million federal grant to build the first 3,000 of these stack and pack them units. That's an 800 square foot unit that the developer gets $100,000 from the federal government just to begin to build. The County Board of Supervisors has said, if you are a sustainable developer, you're immune from any construction defect liability. It's a partnership between selected developers building this new world order and the government using the American taxpayer dollars in order to do it. There is a fast approach to make sustainable development happen here, there, and all across this country. The net effect is going to be that it's going to bankrupt the dollar and bring us into a North American currency situation just like the Europeans. There's a man named Gary Lawrence who was an advisor to the United States President's Council. This was President Clinton, his Council on Sustainable Development. We don't hear these words, but boy, it's all over Washington, D.C. It's all around Congress. He was a U.S. government delegation member to the United Nations 1996 Habitat II Conference. He's a director for the Center for Sustainable Communities at the University of Washington and a chief planner for the city of Seattle. There are a lot of people all over this state with that kind of pedigree who are working behind the scenes to restructure our life for the purpose of eliminating private property. When he was at a United Nations meeting in 1998 in London, he said the following: participating in a UN advocated planning process would very likely bring out many who would actively work to defeat any elected official undertaking local Agenda 21. So we call our processes something else, such as comprehensive planning, that's what the state of Wisconsin uses, growth management, or as we use here in California, smart growth. We have a governor that's probably the second biggest advocate for smart growth of any of the governors in the United States. Terms today that are used are terms like visioning, common, 2020, welcome Sonoma, community plan, and others are used. These programs are always said to be locally driven, but comparisons show remarkable similarities, evidencing a top-down system that conforms to Agenda 21's comprehensive plan blueprint. It is a global to local scheme facilitated with federal dollars and the change agents that our universities are pouring out by the thousands every year. The sustainable goal is the elimination of the middle class. You can say, now, Michael, the middle class is doing fine in America today. We're pumping out so many dollars that it's relatively easy for someone to get by. But you see, it's the pumping out of the dollars that creates the conditions, along with the infrastructure that is being changed in our country, and the bogus attacks on automobile use and suburban housing, that as the dollar begins to implode, will leave this country without the middle class the sustainable developers desire. The green goal includes the listing in a 1,300-page book that came out of the 1992 Rio Conference, sponsored by the United Nations, of what's not sustainable. And as you go through this 1,300 pages, it just goes on and on and on. But a couple of the examples include private property is deemed by those who are running the sustainable programs in all our communities to be not sustainable. Golf courses and ski lodges, irrigation is not sustainable. The world cannot support 6 billion people if we don't irrigate our farms. But you see, the plan behind sustainable development includes population control. It's a program for land use control, education control, and population control. The leaders of the sustainable movement, including people like Dr. Michael Soule from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and David Foreman, who's focused on the Wildlands Project, which I'll talk about in a minute, say that the world's human population should not exceed 500 million people. That's a
start with Mr. Chaikin.
Anton Chaikin. I'm a historian and the history editor for Executive Intelligence Review. President Obama has put in place a reform apparatus reviving the euthanasia of Hitler Germany in 1939 that began the genocide there. The apparatus here is to deny medical care to elderly, chronically ill, and poor people, and thus save, as the president says, $2 to $3 trillion by taking lives considered not worthy to be lived, as the Nazi doctors said. Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel and other avowed cost-cutters on this panel also lead a propaganda movement for euthanasia headquartered at the Hastings Center, of which Dr. Emanuel is a fellow. They shape public opinion and the medical profession to accept a death culture such as the Washington state law passed in November to let physicians help kill patients whose medical care is now rapidly being withdrawn in the universal health disaster. Dr. Emanuel's movement for bioethics and euthanasia and this council's purpose directly continue the eugenics movement that organized Hitler's killing of patients and then other costly and supposedly unworthy people. Dr. Emanuel wrote last October 12th that a crisis, war, and financial collapse would get the frightened public to accept the program. Hitler told Dr. Brandt in 1935 that the euthanasia program would have to wait until the war began to get the public to go along. Dr. Emanuel wrote last year that the Hippocratic Oath should be junked. Doctors should no longer just serve the needs of the patient. Hoche and Binding, the German eugenicists, exactly said the same thing to start the killing. You on the council are drawing up the procedures list to be used to deny care, which will kill millions if it goes ahead in the present world crash. You think perhaps the backing of powerful men, financiers, will shield you from accountability, but you are now in the spotlight. Disband this council and reverse the whole course of this Nazi revival now.
93% reduction of today's population levels. Monotheism is not sustainable, according to the Sustainable Development Guide. Commercial agriculture and the family unit are not sustainable. Sustainable developers have a symbol. It's an interconnecting situation with 3 circles. Each circle represents one of the 3 basic E's for the sustainable developers. The first E is the idea of equity. Equity means to use the law to re-engineer humanity. Instead of concepts of private property and equal justice, it's run by a system of social justice. If you have a 20-year-old child, they've never even heard the notion of equal justice. They've only heard social justice. And with social justice comes, quote, environmental justice and the precautionary principle. You see, the precautionary principle is in the minds of our youth, replacing notions of equal justice. The precautionary principle holds that no human being can take any action that might cause harm. That's why the federal government came into Santa Cruz with its Habitat Conservation Plan and proposed 97 species for special protection that required each landowner who might prospectively, not actually, prospectively have a certain species of plant or animal or bug on their property to do the following. In the case of the long-toed salamander, you couldn't walk on your property during the wintertime because it was its mating season. And if you did walk on your property, your duty under the law, right out of the dark ages, was that you had to prove you didn't step on one. And of course, proving the negative as a basis for justice is the definition of tyranny. If you have a child in the Los Angeles City School District, that means a 3rd grader, they're taught precisely the principles of the precautionary principle. The second E is economy. Now, economy doesn't mean trade, freely given, as we all presume economy to mean. It means the redistribution, the international redistribution of America's wealth. That's why we have policies like NAFTA and CAFTA, to break down the American producer, to give favored treatment to other producers in this hemisphere. It is the effort to destroy the free enterprise farmer, the free enterprise manufacturer, and free enterprise itself. The economy means the replacement of free enterprise with public-private partnerships. Well, Hitler called that for what it is, a public-private partnership, a system of economics based on public-private partnership. The term we hear all the time today is more simply and directly defined as fascism. Fascism was not a system of justice, it was a system of economics. And if you remember the movie Schindler's List, he simply was doing the government's business. Public-private partnership. But the third E takes precedence over all else, and it flows in from the top. It's all about the environment. The environment in this context has no end but to put nature above man. The United States government's support for Sustainable Development, Agenda 21, is very clear. You won't find it in newspapers, tight little grouping of people who own newspapers in America today are themselves sustainable developers. So we don't hear what's happening. But if you dig into the work and you find out who's doing what, it becomes very evident at every level. In 1992, while the Rio Conference was going on, George Bush, then president, was there, not on ground, he was just offshore in Prince Charles's yacht, where he executed the Agenda 21 protocols on behalf of the United States and brought it back to Washington, D.C. Within a year, Bill Clinton by executive order, no congressional review, established the President's Council for Sustainable Development. It included a who's who of the environmental groups, included all of the secretaries of the cabinet, and it had a couple of business people. The chairman of California's Pacific Gas and Electric was one of the three. Ken Lay of Enron was another one. In 1997, the counties and mayors created the Joint Center for Sustainable Communities. And in 2001, the National Governors Association endorsed smart growth. Well, I'll explain what smart growth is in a little bit, but just understand that in essence, smart growth is the urban element of the land use dynamic of sustainable development. We've got to go back and understand the nexus of what causes sustainable development to be an issue in our lives every day. The United Nations is at the center of the sustainable development movement. In 1976, at their Habitat 1 conference, they said, quote, "Private land ownership is also a principal instrument of the accumulation and concentration of wealth, and therefore contributes," here's that term again, "to social injustice. Public control of land use is therefore indispensable." Now, your 100-foot setbacks from intermittent streams in this county is a first big step toward achieving this end. We've done it in Santa Cruz. We did it before anybody knew what sustainable development was. In fact, we had that done with Pete Parkinson as part of the routine before the world knew what sustainable development was, before 1992. Santa Cruz has been a test case in the country and for around the world for the policies of sustainable development. The voters passed a measure called Measure C, Decade of the Environment, in 1990, which looks just like what came out of Rio de Janeiro 2 years later. And now counties around the state and around the country are following Santa Cruz. Sustainable development has two land use action plans. The first one is the so-called Wildlands Project. The Wildlands Project calls for the elimination of human presence on over 50% of the American landscape and heavily controlled activity on most of the rest of American land. Think about that. The land of the free and the home of the brave now has a federal government, a state government, and local governments everywhere working to achieve this end. Reminds me of Vladimir Lenin's a statement about how it is he gets his bureaucrats to do the dirty work for him. He said, most of them don't need to know what we're after. Most of our bureaucrats are simply useful idiots. We only need a few to understand our goals. And that philosophy has swamped the American governmental operations at the federal, state, and local level. This is a map of the Wildlands Project. It was prepared in 1994 based on documents that had been smuggled out of the UN headquarters in Geneva. These documents were smuggled out by a few brave Americans, Michael Kaufman from Maine being primary amongst them, in order to get this information to the United States Congress before it was ready to pass the Wildlands Biodiversity Treaty, which was the product along with Agenda 21 that came out of the 1992 UN conference in Rio de Janeiro. To explain the map, the red are areas that are to be off limits to human beings. No resource development, no human activity. If you live there, you won't. The yellow areas are the areas for major control of all human activity. If you live there, you won't. The black areas, the black dots, are the smart growth zones. That's where human beings are to be stacked and packed in small living units along rail tracks The Smart Growth Program ultimately has jobs assigned and children cared for by the state as you board the train for work. These goals are being achieved today. Look at the dam busting that's happening all across the United States. In fact, Hetch Hetchy, the breaking of Hetch Hetchy Dam up in Yosemite, which waters all of San Francisco, is supported both by Senator Feinstein and Senator Boxer. Forest fuel levels are causing massive fires. That's not because of global warming. That's because you can't manage your forest anymore. It's against the law. The dynamic for these massive fires has been planned. Habitat set-asides and conservation easements mean compliant partnering between owners and the government. The result is, if you enter into a conservation easement, you have given up in perpetuity private property aspect of the property that you've so contracted. The root of all of the wildlands effort is in the Endangered Species Act. The worst fears of many of us from many years ago are coming true as plants, bugs, and animals are deemed more important than people. It is time to repeal, not reform or strengthen, as Congressman Pombo talks about, the Endangered Species Act. America was one of the last countries to take on this legislation, which is everywhere around the world and which was centered in United Nations organizations. You see, when the government controls the natural resources and the land, the government does control or will control all human action. And that's what tyranny is all about. The second element of the land use aspect of sustainable development is so-called smart growth. When Californians threw Gray Davis out of office, they threw the man that put the Wildlands Project in effect in this state. The Sierra is now a 22-county wildlands project. It's called the Sierra Conservancy. And I've spoken in a couple counties up there. People have no idea what's going on. And it strikes me so often that because we don't understand how this is being placed upon us, many people just give up. The excitement about Sonoma is a number of people are rallied against what's wrong. What's needed now is to understand why it is this is coming down on Sonoma and organize so that you get the weed at its root. Because I can tell you one thing about fighting sustainable development policies. If you just go pruning and snipping back the branches, it only fuels it. In Santa Cruz, we had a situation where the public responded because all of the non-farmers' wells were now going to be monitored. And a huge contingent came down to the Board of Supervisors. This was probably 7 or 8 years ago. And they beat it back. Well, the Board of Supervisors hasn't fought, and we're about ready to see them sneak in some regulations to reinstitute the water controls on non-farmers' wells. People in Sonoma need to beat back these creekside ordinances, but don't think that when you've done that, you've won. This is a war, and it will last a long time. Ask your neighbors if they've been lured by the ideas of smart growth. Why it is that so-called sprawl and choice is so bad. Human beings are not sardines. We don't do well when we're all jammed on top of each other. It's a big country. It's a big world. And it's for us to use, enjoy, and protect. That's the nature of human beings. And those who spoil the water or spoil the air need to be criminalized. But those who use the natural resources of our country cannot be precluded unless we are going to allow freedom to slip away, lives to end, and tyranny to begin. Is the development of water resources so bad? Why are we breaking our water resources? You know, the World Bank, now run by the Bush administration, calls for a global limitation for the daily human use of water. It's to be restricted to 10 gallons a day. Well, there are no suburban lots with 10 gallons of water of use per day. It's as though water disappears once you use it. The amount of water on this planet has never changed since the beginning of time. It just changes form and location. And wise use brings water to the needs and uses of people. But the plan is to limit you severely. At 10 gallons of water per day, you don't even take a shower. And what's so distressing about putting more lanes on our freeways in the state? Since Jerry Brown was governor, we don't build new freeways. And it doesn't matter if it's Ronald Reagan or Arnold Schwarzenegger. You see, this is a bipartisan effort. Sustainable development would not be swiftly and quietly moving through this country if the Republicans and the Democrats weren't solidly behind it. One of the wildlands proponents says, when we're done, it'll be the animals on the outside freely roaming the landscape, watching the people on the inside of the walled smart growth communities. This is a list of what we call warm and fuzzy expressions. It's a list worth looking at. These are words that used to appear in a dictionary and they had a meaning. In the newspeak of sustainable development, these words don't mean anything that you grew up thinking them to mean. This is the newspeak understood by those working the inside for bringing us this new world order. I've talked about environment, economy, and equity, but consensus. You see, it used to be that if there were public engagements, there'd be a set of rules you'd go by so that both sides could hear and they could fight it out and the public could hear. It was called the Robert's Rules of Order. Robert's Rules of Order don't exist anymore. You go into these community consensus meetings, Orlean made mention of some here in Sonoma. They happen all the time in Santa Cruz. Consensus means you go along. It's a preconceived outcome with tactics used by trained facilitators to get the audience to the end point. As the public begins to understand what's going on, the rules ratchet down and the public is then put in a little table of 6 people. They assign the 6. There's always a facilitating leader at these tables of 6 people. And if you've got a comment you want to have shared with the audience, the facilitator excludes the comments that don't support the predetermined conclusion. And there's no public way for you to raise your hand and say, what about this? There is no debate. Consensus is the local process for bringing about the New World Order, which is devoid of the idea and ideals of property rights. By restoration, they mean make this landscape look like it did in 1492. That's literally what they mean. So much for farming. Things change. Management practices. That means if you don't do it the federal government, meaning the United Nations way, you'd be kicked off your land. Best management practices are a one-way answer to questions that they can't even ask, much less find a workable answer to. Regionalism, as Charlotte Iserbyt says, is communism. Regional boards exist all across the state, from water quality to air quality. Nobody elects them, but they make all the rules that restrict what you can do, and they're going to make a whole lot more in the next decade. See, when Ronald Reagan said it's time to remake California government, he said, because California government is horse and buggy, Ronald Reagan was wrong. It is a system of local control that is essential to a free society, and it is the regionalization by control boards that is the essence of tyranny. The infrastructure has been set up over the last 3 or 4 decades. We need to build numbers so we can roll that back. You see, the planned evolution utilizes change agents to bring about a process that they call action. Now, action sounds like a fine word, but it too is a code word for the implementers of sustainable development. You see, that teamwork is to change us from a system of self-governance to one of global collectivism. Our foundation is one that leads to liberty. The American foundation is one predicated upon liberty, which is based upon the ideals of unalienable rights, which preserve for each human being their life, their liberty, and their property. You break any of that system of flow, and you end up with tyranny. Global collectivism is about the establishment of tyranny. It is based on the United Nations concept of human rights. And that means we work toward a system of social equity, a new economy, public-private partnership, and a new system of justice, environmental justice. This is happening in every county across the country. Very few locales have gotten the message in a sufficient way to be able to fight it at its root, because the more you break off the branches, the more it grows. You've got to get it at the root, explain to others what is happening, and understand yourself what its effects are. How does all this happen? There's a lot of organizations, and I'm not going to spend all day talking about them, but I'll give an example. One of the organizations that is working the global effort for sustainable development is called ICLEI. That's an acronym for the organization called the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. This is a UN NGO. NGO means non-governmental organization. It also means, to be an NGO, you are accredited by the United Nations for purposes of implementing sustainable development. The American Farm Bureau is an NGO. The Chamber of Commerce is an NGO. You'd be shocked at all the organizations that you belong to that are NGOs. ICLEI is one of them. In its own words, ICLEI is an international association of local governments implementing sustainable development. Our federal government is feeding the idea of creating a global system of global to local, meaning global governance over local areas, eliminating nations. And I don't care who the next president is, he will be a sustainable developer. The Republican Party is a member of the International Democrat Union. So is the Conservative Party in England and 80 other parties around the country. The International Democrat Union calls for the implementation on a global basis of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. That is the end of America. The IDU meets every 4 years in whatever city the Republican Party meets in, with very high security, and high-level Republicans run back and forth between the two conferences. Nothing needs to be said about the Democrat Party. It's pretty obvious that they are globalist in nature. Americans have no alternative today when it comes to the political machinery. Give it to the right, give it to the left. We'll bake. Our federal government agencies are also very clear in their commitment. Remember, I told you that President Clinton made sure that all agencies became implementers of sustainable development. This is the Department of Agriculture. No wonder our farmers are in such trouble. It's very clear from their website that sustainable development is a central piece of USDA policy. Making a sustainable difference, they say, as they advertise the United Nations World Summit on Sustainable Development. Farm policies, starting with NAFTA, are all about implementing sustainable development. When I say farm policies, I mean federal farm policies. As American agriculture goes, so goes the American people. Pause and ask ourselves, which philosophy of rights do we want to work toward? And at this point it gets pretty simple. Because if you boil down all the sophistications, it's a contrast between two systems of government that human beings today are faced with having a choice of. One is the ideas of individual rights, and they're predicated upon the United States Declaration of Independence, probably the greatest achievement in all of human history was that document, what's contained in it. You see, the purpose of government under our Declaration is that government serves to protect the natural or unalienable rights of each of us. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. The Republican Party's dedication to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights deserves a little bit of a look. See, the purpose of government under that concept is that the control of the individual for the greater good of a global community. In Article 29, Section 3 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, it says, quote, "Rights and freedoms may be in no case exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations." Well, who are the men behind the black curtain at the UN? They're the ones deciding what rights and freedoms exist for whom and for when. Do you really think it's Kofi Annan? You see, in short, under the American system, you're born with rights and government exists to protect those rights. You and the product of your labor belong to you. But under the emerging system of global governance, government will grant, restrict, and withdraw your rights according to its needs. You and the product of your labor belong to the community. President Bush, 3 years ago, said, quote, "The United States of America is committed to the United Nations, and we show that commitment by working to fulfill the UN's stated purposes and give meaning to its ideals. We'll have no less of a commitment to the UN from Hillary Clinton or John McCain or Al Gore or John Kerry or any other name you can think of who might be the next president." See, political globalists are moving toward a form of what I'll call state capitalism. It's an assault on land, and that's where we have to stand up and protect our land and protect our neighbor's land. It's about the growth of public-private partnerships and the growing war on free enterprise. Other Agenda 21 issues to put your eyes on are the human health care issues, which are increasingly calling for the surrender of individuality to sustainability. We're embedding a system of, quote, comprehensive planning. It is, in the words of Al Gore, the reinvention of government. Christianity is being redefined toward a global religion. Who's going to win that race? It is about the central control of education, as Orlene talked about. Our schools are building global citizens and human drones. It's about globalist trade policy. And it designs the creation of monetary uncertainty. I'd like to do this chart to summarize how the sustainable developers are organized. On the right, as we move toward this collectivist one world, we've got public-private partnerships. Okay, the few guys who will take federal money to build government housing that's advertised as a leftist movement. But it's the few guys working for those partnerships that come from the right side of this political spectrum. On the left side, it's all those advocates of social justice. Treat everyone fairly. Protect the environment. You see, those are the two sides of one coin. That coin is sustainable development. Sustainable development is a government-controlled society. It's tyranny. You got smart growth, and you got the Wildlands Project. It's Agenda 21, usually championed by the left. Regionalism, championed by the right. Collectivism, championed by the left. And the UN Charter, amazingly, I'll claim, is championed by the right. Together, they're working toward a common end. Americans are asked to subscribe to one team or the other, as though there's a choice in being on one side or the other of a two-sided coin. You get government education on the left or the right. Bush and Kennedy were the champion partners for the No Child Left Behind legislation, which decimates learning in America. We've got fraud coming from the left with their environmental shenanigans. We've got an interventionist military policy coming from the right. When we end up, we're living in a police state. The left and the right are not the answers to what ails America. They are the problem. You see, liberty is based on freedom. And freedom requires the development of human conscience. And the system that does that is parenthood. And a society that relies on family first is a society that learns to express itself in a way that's constructive and associate in a way that's productive. And trade, honest free trade, results from that. Freedom brings us genuine peace, not the kind of peace of a no-war policy, but the freedom, the peace that comes through individual liberty and private property and the willingness to stand up to defend those ideas. And if that's the condition of a society, we end up with prosperity and abundance. And the greatest foundation in the history of humankind for that kind of society is the Declaration of Independence. I suggest that we need to look at the political spectrum as an up-down political spectrum. Liberty at the top, tyranny at the bottom. Understand that it's the Declaration and building a society predicated upon the principles of the Declaration of Independence that brings us liberty. And if we fall for the sustainable development, global to local dynamic of stealing private property with such things as 100-foot setbacks from your own property on both sides, that we begin the downward road that we're already on, called sustainable development. And that's what must be understood and fought. If we're to declare our independence, we'll need to follow the principles of liberty. If we want freedom and abundance, we've got to maintain parental control, not federal control, over how our children are educated. We need a defensive military policy, not a military policy that brings the world to its knees while we all fight each other so that the globalist order takes place. Individual liberty and economic liberty are partners in this effort. Free expression and free association for each of us. Free enterprise and private property as one chooses. It's important to know what we're dealing with. You can't fight an enemy you don't know, because they just will appear and reappear, and if you don't understand their essence, you won't be able to anticipate and fight. There are thousands of attacks that are going on right now. In other words, the Wildlands Project is moving across this country.
Would you like to see all the executive orders that have been put into place to take over our nation, to have complete control over us, to take away our rights, round us up, and put us where they want us? Here we go. Executive Order 10990 allows the government to take over all modes of transportation and control of all highways and seaports. Executive Order 10995 allows the government to seize and control the communication media. Executive Order 10997 allows the government to take over all electrical power, gas, petroleum, fuels, and minerals. Executive Order 10998 allows the government to seize all means of transportation, including personal cars, trucks, or vehicles of any kind, and total control over highways, seaports, and waterways. Executive Order 10999 allows the government to take over all food resources and farms. Executive Order 11000 allows the government to mobilize civilians into work brigades under government supervision. Executive Order 11001 allows the government to take over all health, education, and welfare functions. Executive Order 11002 designates the Postmaster General to operate a national registration of all persons. Executive Order 11003 allows the government to take over all airports and aircraft, including commercial aircraft. Executive Order 11004 allows a Housing and Finance Authority to relocate communities, build new housing with public funds, designate areas to be abandoned, and establish new locations for populations. Executive Order 11005 allows the government to take over railroads, inland waterways, and public storage facilities. Executive Order 11051 specifies the responsibility of the Office of Emergency Planning and gives authorization to put all executive orders into effect in times of increased international tensions and economic or financial crisis. Executive Order 11310 grants authority to the Department of Justice to enforce the plans set out in executive orders, to institute industrial support, to establish judicial and legislative liaison, to control all aliens, to operate penal and correctional institutions, and to advise and assist the President. Executive Order 11049 assigns emergency preparedness function to federal departments and agencies, consolidating 21 operative executive orders issued over a 15-year period. Executive Order 11921 allows the Federal Emergency Preparedness Agency to develop plans to establish control over the mechanisms of production and distribution of energy sources, wages, salaries, credit, and the flow of money in U.S. financial institution in any undefined national emergency. It also provides that when a state of emergency is declared by the President, Congress cannot review the action for 6 months. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has broad powers in every aspect of the nation. General Frank Salzito, chief of FEMA's Civil Security Division, stated in a 1983 conference that he saw FEMA's role as a new frontier in the protection of individual and governmental leaders from assassination and of civil and military installations, from sabotage and or attack, as well as prevention of dissident groups from gaining access to U.S. opinion or a global audience in times of crisis. FEMA's powers were consolidated by President Carter to incorporate the National Security Act of 1947 that allows for strategic relocation of industries, services, government, and other essential economic activities, and to rationalize the requirements for manpower, resources, and production facilities. The 1950 Defense Production Act gives the President sweeping powers over all aspects of the economy. The Act of August 29, 1916 authorizes the security of the Army in time of war to take possession of any transportation system from transporting troops, material, or any other purpose related to the emergency. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act enables the President to seize the property of a foreign country or national. These powers were transferred to FEMA in a sweeping consolidation in 1979. Now all they have left to do is take the guns.